Okay, so the title of my presentation is called Rhythm and Intention is the New Flow. And you'll understand very soon what I mean by that. So I've been studying attention and productivity for a long time with people's technology, and in fact, for decades. And I'm going to talk about something that's going to sound very provocative, which is I want us to not think about productivity as our main goal, but rather I want to think about reframing this whole conversation and our main goal should be really striving for well-being. And then I'm going to explain along the way, we'll end up being productive. But when we talk about productivity and use of our devices, there's four modern myths that have arisen, right, in public conversation. And these narratives are just not backed up by science. And I want to go into what these are, and I'll explain why they're myths. So myth number one, we should strive to be as focused as much as we can on our computers. Let's put every ounce of creative juice into trying to be productive. And we should feel guilty if we can't focus. Okay, I'm sure you've heard this narrative. Myth number two, okay, we all do some kind of rote, mindless activity. We surf the internet, we scroll through Facebook and Twitter, we play silly games. My favorite silly game is a panagram game. And so the myth here is that doing this kind of mindless activity is just wasteful of our time. Myth number three. So you've all heard about flow. Flow is this notion that was presented by the psychologist Csikszentmihalyi, which is the idea that flow is the optimal creative experience that humans can have. And it's the ideal combination of being challenged and using our skills. And therefore, flow should be the ideal state that we should strive for when we use our devices. And I'm going to talk about why that's a myth. Myth number four, the distractions, the interruptions, and the multitasking we experience on a daily basis is due to our own lack of self-discipline. And as a result, there's been a number of books, self-help books that have come up, how we can be more productive, lots of tips and techniques. And, some of these are actually quite good, but the myth here is that our lack of productivity, our lack of being able to focus, our being distracted is due to solely to our self-discipline. And I will point out that people do get interrupted a lot, but about half the time, people are interrupted by themselves. And it's just uncanny. If you were to observe people, you'll see that people are, working on, say, a Word document, and then all of a sudden, for no explainable reason, they suddenly switch their attention and they check email, or they check social media, or they pick up their phone and start texting. Those are self-interruptions. And those are as frequent as being interrupted by something external to us, like a notification. So let's talk about busting these myths. Okay. Myth number one, we should strive to be focused as much as we can on our computers. Well, the science shows that we can't sustain long focus in the same way that we just can't lift weights for long periods of time without just getting exhausted. So our attention follows natural rhythms. So in our research, we find that people have peak points of focus at about 11 a.m. and then again about mid-afternoon, about 3 p.m. These are natural rhythms for most people. And this is on a longer time scale, the scale of about a day. But if we view this as a fractal, we really zoom in, we would find that attention actually fluctuates on a momentary basis. So people don't have long extended periods of focus in a natural way, but they're always switching between being focused on what's external to them and inwardly focused. And so the upshot is that we need to find a balance between different kinds of attentional states. And there are different kinds of attentional states. We can be focused. We can also have this kind of mindless, easy, engaging kind of attention. Busting myth number 2, the rote, mindless activity that we're so attracted to do on our devices is wasteful of our time. And I argue that no, rote activity actually has a very important function for us, right? We have a limited amount of cognitive or attentional resources. And when we use these up, right, our performance suffers. This has been shown for decades in the laboratory. And if we look on a longer scale over the course of the day, we see that also attention tends to wane over the course of the day. But when you do this kind of rote, mindless activity, it enables us to step back and we can replenish these cognitive resources. There's lots of ways to replenish it. We can take a break and walk outside. That's the best of all, right? But we can also replenish while we're using our devices. Plus, this kind of rote, mindless activity makes us happy. And that's what our research shows. Rote attention is the happiest state of attention. Now, obviously, we just can't do rote activity all day and make ourselves happy all day. So we really need to strike a balance. Busting myth number 3, right? Everyone wants to achieve flow. Let's strive for flow. Well, it turns out that flow is quite rare in knowledge work. And I imagine that most of the people in this audience do knowledge work, which means that the primary task that you do is engaging in some way with digital information. Now, there are ways to achieve flow on computers, right? People who do complex coding can get into flow. People who create electronic music on their computers can get into flow. People who might create art on their computers. People who play video games for extended periods can get into flow. There's a lot of ways you can use your computer and get into flow, right? But remember, flow is about using your skills. It's about being creative. So, watching a Netflix movie or a YouTube video, that's not getting you into flow, right? It's engaging your attention, but you're not in a flow state, right? It's really about the nature of the activity that gets us into flow. I started out by being an artist, right? That was my first career. It was very, very short-lived, I admit, but I used to get into flow all the time, and I understand what it means to get into flow. And now, my work as a scientist, it's fulfilling. I enjoy it. It's hard work, but honestly, I'm rarely in flow. So it's really about the nature of the work that makes it conducive to a flow experience. Myth number 4, right? The distractions, the interruptions, the multitasking that we experience all the time is due to our lack of discipline. Okay, so my answer to that is we don't use technology in a vacuum, right? We are part of, we have a cultural experience, we have a social experience. We are subject to a number of underlying forces that influence our attention when we're on our devices. And these forces can be tied to social influences, environmental influences, and technological influences. And let me give you some examples of what these are. So I imagine that most of you are very aware of these discussions about targeted algorithms and how tech companies, not just the tech giants, but also advertising companies, design algorithms based on what they learn about us when we go on the internet, right? We leave digital traces, and then all of this information is used to construct an algorithm to try to get at the very core of our personality so that it can really attract us. It knows what we like, and these targeted algorithms are designed to just capture and steer our attention. They use what's called bottom-up salience from a neuroscience perspective. And what that means is that they use our automatic attention, right? There's automaticity involved. Bottom-up salience actually comes from, we've evolved to pay attention to things that move very fast, and we pay attention in a very automated fashion. You know, the early hunters and gatherers had to always scan the environment looking for predators, and anything that moved in the bush would attract their attention. Well, you know, now on our screens, any kind of notification that flashes across, or the sound of a chime from our phones, that captures our attention in an automatic way. And we can't help but pay attention to these kinds of stimuli. Another example of technological forces that influence our attention is, believe it or not, the very design of the internet itself. So Vannevar Bush, right, when he conceived of the memics, which was the precursor to the design of the internet, he designed the memics idea so that it would map onto very well the way that human memory is structured. And human memory, the theory of semantic memory is that memory is structured in terms of associations. So if I say fire engine, you might automatically come up with an association to ambulance. And from ambulance, you might automatically come up with an association to the word car, right? So that's how we think in terms of associations. Now, when we surf the internet, let's say we're surfing Wikipedia, right? And as we're reading the content, right, we're just primed to be thinking of these links and paying attention to the links because we've got the context, right? Our curiosity is raised and we see a link and we're just drawn to click on those links to continue this associative path. So the design of the internet greases the wheels for our memory to just go sailing through the internet. Now, we are social beings, right? We're social creatures in the real world, right? We can't help but be influenced by other people. We want to maintain social capital, which means, you know, we want to do favors for other people because we expect favors in return from them. We're very careful about how we construct our identities and present ourselves to others. And yes, of course, power is involved. And so the reason why we're just drawn to social media, why we're drawn to email, right, is because of these social forces. We're drawn to answering email because we want to maintain that balance of social capital. Because if I do something nice for you and answer your email, I'm going to expect sometime in the future that you might do something for me. And if it's someone, you know, some person who I'm not familiar with, right? Maybe I feel, oh, maybe there's a job offering here at some point in the future. So I'm gonna pay attention to this email because maybe sometime in the future, this person might come back and reward me. So all of these kinds of influences are wrapped up in our use of social media, email, and that helps explain why we're so distracted by these. Now, this is another kind of force that you may not realize. And the idea is that we have short attention spans. When we watch TV, when we watch film, when we watch music videos, when we watch ads, when we use social media, turns out, at least for the average American, we spend about 10 hours a day on any screen. About 5.5 hours is our computer and phone screens. The rest of it is TV or film screens. Turns out in the UK, people watch a little bit less television than Americans do. I think it's something like 3.5 hours on average. But the point here is that screen real estate has become more competitive for our attention. So film directors, TV directors, advertisement companies, they're all competing for our attention. And as a result, right, a lot of the lengths of TV film shots and film shots as well have shortened over time, significantly shortened over time. If any of you ever watch blockbuster films, films like The Transformer, those films change scenes about every 2 seconds, of course. And it may be hard to follow the narrative of that film, but maybe that doesn't really matter because you're getting a head rush with these fast scene changes and your head is just being whipped around. Your attention is just whiplashed from one scene to another. And we've become used to that. So we've become used to having these kinds of short attention spans. Ads used to be about 60 seconds on average, and except for US Super Bowl ads, which are still 60 seconds, other ads have shortened to about 15 seconds, driven by the profit motive, because you can get more bang for the buck in a shorter amount of time. And of course, we all know that social media constrains the length of content that we can put into tweets. Facebook posts are short, texting tends to be short. So all of these different types of media that we're exposed to in a very broad way on a daily basis, they all conspire to keep our attention spans short. Now, you may not realize, but personalities also play a role. It's our individual differences that just make the world go round, right? It's wonderful to meet people who are different. But we are born with a certain deck of cards that predispose us to behave in certain ways. We can change, of course we can change, but these are predispositions that we have. Turns out people who are born with a propensity to be neurotic, these are people who are warriors, people who tend to replay events over and over in their minds. They tend to have shorter attention spans on their devices, and this is what we've measured. People who are conscientious, people who are diligent in their work, turns out we've also found that these tend to be people who are continuous email checkers. These are the people who are on sentry duty and they don't want anything to slip through the cracks, so they're always monitoring and checking their emails. So I argue, let's reframe the narrative. Instead of trying to think about how we can squeeze out that last juice of productivity from people, let's think instead of how we can find balance in different attentional states and different activities, because the main goal really should be about striving for well-being. And if we do that, and if we think about the fact that we have a limited amount of cognitive resources, and we do things throughout the day that just drain our resources, right? If we can think about how to preserve our resources, right, we will be productive along the way. So I argue that rhythm and attention is the new flow. And if you're interested at all in any of the things that I talked about, these will all be coming out soon in a much more in-depth in my book, Attention Span. And I hope to be able to continue the conversation with all of you. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tyler.
That was great. Thanks, Gloria. I like whenever we chat because I feel like I always learn at least a few new things that I'd never thought about before. So
and likewise for me.
Yeah, great. So I'm going to jump into things. And so we had an interactive component that I sort of shared online. And I thought I would use this to frame my my contribution for this is that, so these are on Twitter. First question was, and caveat, of course, entirely informal, unscientific poll. If you want to vote, still time to vote. So it was 1 day left on one of the polls, actually, so you can get it on my Twitter. How, on average, how distracted do you feel during work? Keep in mind, I asked this on Twitter. So the fact that some people do Twitter for their work, but the majority were occasionally, often, and then the winner was I'm distracted right now, hence checking on my Twitter poll. Second question, which I'm going to come back to, is another informal poll just for fun. Do you ever find yourself so busy that when you rush and multitask, leisure activities? Check that out. Over 80%. So 4 out of 5 of us said yes, me included. I've done it. Again, that'll come up, but I thought I would kind of start with some of these things, not for scientific use. Don't ever use cite Twitter polls for anything, but yeah, we'll use that to kind of frame where we're at with things. So I want to echo something that Gloria said, that we're not anti-digital, we're not anti-distraction in a way. In a lot of ways, distractions can be helpful. I like this little cartoon from Gemma Coral because it talks about, it takes a very friendly approach. When I was a college student, which is increasingly longer and longer ago, I had such a problem with the P word, procrastination, that I felt very guilty in terms of, it's like, well, I should be working all the time. I should be doing all of these things. It's familiar. Spending time on social media. Social media didn't exist when I was in college. So that ages myself a little bit, but doing things like TV or laundry or things that we actually use to restore us are an important part of our workflow. So I think Gloria's really onto something when it comes to rhythm and periodic breaks and these sort of things. So more to say on this in a second. That I want to pick up what Gloria just mentioned in terms of, we have finite attention spans, right? There is no such thing as focusing for 8 hours a day on one thing until blood comes out of your ears. We can try, but we can't really do that. So through the magic of the internet, I'm actually tweeting out these links right now as we're talking. If you want to check these out later, see, look, my hands are free. So I'm actually tweeting the things and multitasking at the same time. So you can grab those later afterwards. If you're interested in any of the things that I'm talking about here, but essentially our attention spans ebb and flow. I like Gazelli and Rosen's book on this. They're a psychologist and a neuroscientist as well, I think. But just like Gloria just told us about with the bottom up attention span, some of this is how our brains have evolved. Specifically, the thesis of the book, or I should say one of the theses of the book, is that the reason why social media can be so addictive and habit forming is that things like negative emotions, anything that our reactive brains register as a threat, and in some cases that could mean diminishment of social capital. These are things that we tend to be prone towards. There's a whole nother talk in the topic of why do we see so much bad news? Why do we tend to see so many negative things and doom scrolling and all of that? But if you're noticing these things, none of them are a coincidence. So we can talk about some of these things. Me personally, what got me into the topic of distractions and attention spans was our interest in reading. So can we actually change our distractibility and focus? And I get this question often here too in Cambridge and all over the place. Yes, it seems like we can. So in terms of Marianne Wolf, who's a neuroscientist, I think she's at UCLA now. Anyways, her book is really good in terms of it talks specifically about reading habits in the brain. She has a great anecdote about how she herself, someone who knows this topic inside and out, had a hard time reading I think it was Moby Dick or Vanity Fair or something. And she just struggled to get through it, possibly because those books are boring, but possibly because she just couldn't sustain the focus that she noticed. She was basically, like a lot of us have, probably in this virtual room right now, we've kind of trained our brains to do bite-sized sort of things, click, click, read, click, click, read. Me personally, in case anyone is curious, I use the Pomodoro Technique whenever I'm feeling extra antsy. So the basic idea of the Pomodoro Technique, it's you can use a timer or any sort of thing. There's free apps for it, but it works within the limits of our natural attention span limits, so that you can say, it's like, I want to work in this task for 5, 10, 20 minutes, then you take a little break and you actually stop during that. So it doesn't work for everyone, but it's at least something to try if you find yourself, kind of slow to get into a task and these sort of things. So Pomodoro Technique can work for reading, for work, for those of us that are knowledge workers, but I've certainly got a lot of mileage out of it. I'm going to jump topics a little bit. I'm also sharing these links online as well, but thinking in terms of productivity versus leisure time. So the title of our talk, how much does productivity really mean? The other side of the coin is that we really do need leisure time and breaks in order to to be productive. Well-being and breaks and leisure time are part of productivity. These things aren't opposed. So I should have put a question mark on this slide, because they're all kind of different ends of the spectrum, in my opinion. There's a very interesting article from BBC Work Life that basically talks about the optimization now of our leisure time. The fact that we're trying to rush through things. I have a great example coming up in one slide, so hang on for a second. But basically ways that we're trying to squeeze as much as we can out of our leisure time, but to the point that using productivity hacks on leisure time is actually self-defeating. There's another report from Microsoft that I thought I would share. Specifically, they were talking about back-to-back meetings, which I hate. So there's science to prove why back-to-back meetings are so awful. We need a break. They've done actually some brain scans in terms of our attention spans, just going this the longer we're on Zoom calls and having to switch gears and all of these things. So let me talk about leisure time a little bit. Productive leisure time. I think I'm just curious in this, amongst the things that I'm interested in researching are how our digital habits change. So I stumbled upon this Audible blog post a while ago, and this got me thinking. So this is in 2017, right? But they kind of surveyed a bunch of their listeners, and they found, so what is your X rating, meaning your speed? So as in not just listening to it at normal speed, but people are often saying 1.5 speed, 2 times higher. So this has become a thing that for some types of reading, perhaps this makes sense or I should say listening in this case. For leisure listening/reading of audiobooks, it starts to get into a little bit of muddled territory. Some of you might have seen that Netflix, within the recent future, did add playback speed, so that for the people that were trying to power watch things, I'm not sure what to call this term exactly, speed watching, you could crank it up a little bit. But saying this is one thing, saying that this is a habit is one thing. I made a couple clips, so let's actually see what this looks like. Hopefully you can hear it, because this will give you an example of what this actually means for people who do this. I talk about it in terms of why. I'm just curious, not in a judgmental sort of way, of course, but why do we do this? Why do we feel the need to speed through our leisure time for some of these things? Yeah, I throw that out there as a question. I'm curious if anyone wants to take the poll or chime in with the audience questions later, we can talk about that. An alternative, I would say, to what I just showed is scheduling distraction time. So Neil Fiore wrote this book called The Now Habit. He basically flips the schedule thing so that most of us put our work stuff and our obligations first on the calendar. The unscheduled basically flips that on its head and says, schedule the rest stuff first, and then figure out the work time things. And rest means everything that is outside of your normal professional life. It's the stuff you do as a human being, whether that's family time, grocery shopping, exercise, leisure time, putting that in so that we realize we actually aren't working or supposed to work 16 hours a day. So this is another way to kind of flip it. I like the idea of when I say scheduling your distraction time, what I really mean is just being aware of it, which leads me to my next slide. I'm more of so there's a carrot and stick approach. My personality is such that I kind of prefer carrot versus stick. So I feel like one of the things that works for me, and again, we can kind of talk about this a little bit in the Q&A coming up, is the idea that you can use your distractions for your own good. In terms of, for me personally, so Monday morning is a work day. I've got my to-do list. There are certain tasks that I really don't like doing first thing in the week. But I couple that with things that I know I habitually want to do. Check the news, especially baseball scores. I really want to check the baseball scores. So for whatever anyone, it could be checking Instagram first thing in the morning. But in order to get yourself there, that's your virtual carrot. Getting through the one thing first, whatever that very unpleasant thing can be a good way to actually use the fact that you have digital distractions and habits and see if you can kind of couple those together. Anyways, that's what I do. I find that very motivating. And then I'll leave on kind of a similar note that Gloria did, and we'll kind of do some chatting about stuff, and then hopefully hear from you. Is that I think there are such a thing as good distractions and bad distractions. Some good distractions can be the ones that we find kind of uplifting, whatever it is. If it is checking in on Facebook or sending messages, text messages to friends, as opposed to the kind of scrolling, say, infinite scrolling on Instagram or TikTok or these kind of things that tend to kind of tire us out a little bit, or occasionally, because it's intermittent reinforcement, occasionally stress us out. We'll see stuff about war and politics and COVID and these sort of things in between cute pictures of dogs and things that we find entertaining. So kind of being a little more deliberate about our distraction consumption habits can be something that I think we have a lot of control over. So I think I'll leave that on that topic in terms of, so all of my links that I mentioned are available on Twitter for you to check out later after the talk. Those are the top 4 ways to contact me online in case anyone has any questions about this. But I think let's go interactive now. So let's ask some questions and maybe chat about things. And then as people are chatting, so we have a chance to chat, Gloria, I thought I would ask you a couple of questions while people are writing their questions and then joining us for conversation. But how about you? Any favorite digital or productivity tips or tricks that work for you that you think are your go-tos?
Yeah. So let me talk about just two of them. So when the pandemic first started, the university had a course in mindfulness. And the purpose of the course was to get us to de-stress, right? If you're not familiar with mindfulness, the idea is to get you to focus on now, like what's happening right now. And so I took the course and I found it very helpful. And then I realized that I could modify this idea of mindfulness and I could apply it to help myself gain control over my attention. And so I call it meta awareness. And meta awareness means being aware of what you know and what you don't know, being aware of what you're doing. And so you practice meta awareness by asking yourself questions about what are you doing right now? Why are you doing? What's the reason you're doing it? So before I go to Twitter, before I go to check news, I ask myself, why am I doing this? Do I need a break, right? Can I wait for a bit? Is this how important it is? People make two kinds of framing errors when they do distractions. The first kind of framing error is a mistake in how worthwhile they believe that the activity is. And the second kind of error is how long we're going to spend doing it, right? And people are notoriously bad at estimating the amount of time that we're going to do things. So going back to meta awareness, I try to avoid these kind of errors by asking myself, is this going to be worthwhile, right? And if I go onto Twitter or Facebook or read news, how much time do I intend to spend there? So that's one thing. Let me just say really, really quickly, and it relates to what you talked about, Tyler, is the idea that we should design our day knowing that we have a limited amount of cognitive resources, and we have to think very intentionally about what kinds of activities will drain our resources, what kinds will replenish us, and let's design our day with that in mind. So if you're going to do something really hard, you better design something, some leisure activity or rote activity in, right? So that we're just not getting too drained.
I think that's really interesting. I was taking notes on that in terms of I kind of do a time budget when it comes to digital distractions and social media, but it's not that precise. I don't even use things like the iOS number of minutes and things, because sometimes I want an extra 5 minutes to read a thing, and sometimes I don't. So the tools are there, but it's so hard to predict sometimes.
Yeah, and humans are not algorithms, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
the devices are using algorithms to steer our attention, but I really think that humans have the power, the agency to be able to design our own personal attention spans and patterns.
Speaking of, like, we talked about a number of things already, and then I'll be quiet in a second so that we can do some question and answer from everyone else. So one of your studies, the one about email and multitasking and checking emails that everyone cites whenever they talk about digital habits and multitasking and stuff. I'm just curious, like, what do you think in terms of in the past 20, 25 years, like, are we more productive now than we were then? And conversely, are we more distracted now than we were then?
I would say, the jury is out. Are we more productive? Because how do you measure productivity? If you're an assembly line worker, yeah, you can measure productivity. But if you're a knowledge worker, it's just so hard. It's an idea some of us who work in this area have been grappling with for a long time. But I can say empirically that our attention spans have shortened. We first started tracking attention spans on our devices back in 2004. And they have, at that time, people spent about 150 seconds of attention at one time on the screen. People switched activities of any kind of activity every 3 minutes in the workplace. And at the time, everybody was astounded that they were saying, oh my God, 3 minutes, well, now it turns out over the last several years, and it's just not just my own work, but others have replicated it. Our attention spans are around a steady state of about 40 seconds, 47 seconds on any screen before switching. The median is about 40 seconds. And because it's the median, it means half the time our attention spans are shorter than 40 seconds. So so attention spans have shortened over the years.
Yeah, wow. I have more questions, but let's go to the audience. Julian, should we pick a couple from Q&A and things that are coming?
So there's definitely a few questions. I mean, what you've said so far, the two of you, has been absolutely fascinating, and I've been scribbling down notes that I may try and use. I have some sand hourglasses at work so that I can time myself, and an old school thing. And there's so many other things. We do have a number of questions. Can I just ask one thing though, because it seems to me that part of what you're really talking about was giving yourself permission to not work rather than feeling bad about it. There's a wonderful cartoon I remember seeing last summer of an academic's holiday, where they say, I've got a break from teaching. I can really focus on doing some work, but I also need to relax and unwind. So what I end up doing is neither the work nor the unwinding, because I keep thinking I should be doing the other one. Just before we come on to the other questions, how important is that permissioning?
I would say that's the central thesis of my book, which I'm trying to say, yes, give yourself permission to be distracted, to just lay off the focus and productivity narrative, right? And if you do that, you will find that a knock-on effect is that you'll end up being productive, because when we're less stressed, we're more positive, and when we're more positive, we can do more. And that's a robust finding in psychology. Being positive enables people to do more.
The other thing I would add to that, and I agree, I think, is that there is a difference between different, Gloria, you mentioned kind of work in terms of like really focused work and more rote work. That part is really important. I think I need at least two hands to count the number of people that I met during my PhD who, would say they work 12 hours a day. And I was like, oh, wow, 12 hours a day. And then when I actually see them working on it, it's like half the time was WhatsApp, Facebook, Twitter. And I was like, well, what about 6 hours of work and mushing that down, and then the rest of the time? I mean, we know pretty well now that multitasking is a bad deal for just about all of us. We're bad at it. We're slower at it than doing each thing individually. So there's something to be said about that. If we want to actually have more leisure time too, it's cultivating a little bit of that like in-depth focus in these things.
So we have a number of questions, so there's still time to put more questions in. Please do use the Q&A tab, and you can put the questions there. And you can either admit to who you are, in which case I will say who you are, or you can come in as one of our regular attendees, anonymous attendee. And Anonymous has asked us, there's a question about this. Something else I think might be worth adding to the narrative is the fact that what you're consciously aware of thinking about is not everything your brain is actually working on. What do you think? I mean, it's certainly something I've seen in my own work, and my PhD supervisor used to talk about letting ideas percolate subconsciously. What's your take on that?
I would say that's absolutely right on, right? We have two different kinds of attention. We have conscious attention. We have this kind of non-conscious attention. And it's very important to distinguish these two. Now, sometimes non-conscious attention can intrude into conscious attention in the following way. We get primed all the time. And if you're reading a Wikipedia article, we can be primed by links on that Wikipedia article. And this priming is a non-conscious type of attention. And then as a result, we click on that link, right? And we pursue it. So, and a lot of internet surfing, it's a combination of using conscious attention and also the reacting non-consciously to certain ideas. So in our use of devices, we are just, surrounded by all kinds of stimuli that can tap into our non-conscious processes.
Yeah, the one thing for anyone that's interested, I think the researcher's name is Jonathan Smallwood. It's Smallwood something, but basically there have been a couple studies, I think it was UC Santa Barbara, that mind wandering and some distractions, and it's a little bit of the kind of like in the shower aha moment thing is good for creativity and brainstorming. And there does seem to be something about that. That's not a new phenomenon, of course, like that's something we've known about for quite a while, but there is something to be said about downtime and putting things on the back burner as a way to work on things.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you walk away from a hard problem and you let it incubate, in fact, doing this kind of rote activity is a great way to let other ideas incubate and coming up with creative solutions for them.
Wonderful. So to move on, there's a question from Diane Gorski, who says, is there actually an argument for digital multitasking? Recognizing the downsides, but can it be appropriate in some situations?
Well, yes. I'm struggling to find a reason why it can be useful. First of all, it's what people naturally do, right? And so if you want to say it's what people naturally do, then yes, I suppose that's a positive thing, as opposed to trying to make people focus and do something that's less than natural. So, it depends what you mean by multitasking. It's not humanly possible to do two difficult tasks at the same time. Our attention rapidly shifts between them. It's just not humanly possible to parallel process. But if one of those tasks is really easy, we can do it. So, if I'm driving, I can drive and I can have a conversation with someone, because driving is automatic. It's not a hard activity. But as soon as a bicyclist, goes in front of my car, then all of a sudden I have to, restructure my attention and focus on that bicyclist. And I stop talking and I put all of my attentional resources on what's in front of me. So people are agile in how they shift attention. And so I think this kind of agility can be very positive. And I think if people can learn how to harness this kind of agility, then I think it could be very positive. So knowing when to focus and what to focus on versus, when to just kind of hold back and focus on something else.
I would add to that my audiobook example that I mentioned before, because I'm really curious now what people do when they listen to audiobooks. The majority of people say they do something that would be construed as multitasking. Commute is a big one. Chores, exercise are often the ones. A very small minority of people actually will listen to audiobooks intentionally, just not doing anything at all. But that is one kind of multitasking that might possibly be easier. Washing dishes, for the most part, fairly mechanical, as opposed to being on a Zoom call and answering an email at the same time. That's not really multitasking. That's really jumping from one thing to another and probably making mistakes and not paying attention to either one very well. So there are different kinds of multitasking.
Can I now move on to two questions? I'll see if you can multitask with two questions, but they are very related rather than. So one attendee points out the fact that there's variety. So I would also bring up the idea that people should remain aware of and factor in human individual variation. One size doesn't fit all. So that's a sort of general thing. But there's a particular question that I'd like to pick up on from somebody who says, given that men and women have different abilities in focusing, men being more single-minded, women better at multitasking, and I've just heard we are bad at multitasking, does the research behind this statement recognize sexual differences, or has it been conducted by men on men and is being applied to men and women? Now, I don't know how many of those claims are correct about the research, but there's this general variation, particularly that gendered variation, that'd be interesting to hear from you about.
So I can address that. And yes, we do study both men and women. And if I were to have you do a thought experiment, and if I were to ask you who is better at interrupting themselves less, and if they're interrupted, getting back on tasks faster, who would you say? Would you say it's men are better, women are better, or there's no difference? What would you say, Julian? I think, Tyler, you probably know this.
I would guess the variation between individuals is larger than the average variation between gender groups.
Okay, that's a good guess. Turns out women are better. So even though there absolutely is variation between people, the variation between different genders actually is greater. And women are, and this is empirically tested, they're faster at getting back onto the interrupted task, and they do self-interrupt less. And if I can offer an interpretation, I would say it's because, women, especially in the kinds of, information work fields that we see, women have to perform above and beyond what their male counterparts do just to be perceived on an equal playing field. And I've heard that over and over again from people.
Yeah, I thought Gloria answered that pretty thoroughly. I'll just add to the first part, the first kind of first part of the question about individual human variation. Also keep in mind that attention spans vary within an individual, not just across individuals, but different times of day, different contexts, different things that, for example, maybe painters are easy, it's easier for them to get into a flow state when they're painting as opposed to doing different kinds of knowledge work. Or we know chronotype, as in like whether you're a morning person or a night person, factors into this. I thought the 11 a.m. thing was a good factoid too about, yeah, we know when we're sharpest. We know a lot of people, for most of my professional life, I've known that after lunchtime is the worst time for me. Even when I eat healthy, even when I eat like salad and tuna and all these things, I still don't really want to do anything hard for the hour or two after lunch. So being aware of that is also another thing to keep in mind.
There's a number of things coming in about various different topics, but can I ask about ages? We talked a lot about workplace, but there's a question that's come in about building good attention among children. How can we work on attention for those developing in the tech-driven world?
You want me to take it, or you want to take it, Tyler?
You first, Gloria.
Okay, so yeah, kids are getting onto screens from a very young age and spending a lot of time on screens. I forget the exact statistic. I'd have to look it up. But there are studies that show that when young children are exposed to fast-paced videos, it actually affects their attention spans afterwards. So they've done experiments where they take, half the children are watching these really fast-paced videos. I talked about earlier how scene shots, have gotten significantly shorter over the years. When children watch this, right, half of them watch those, the other half do some other kind of task that doesn't involve attention switching. And then they're given another task. The kids who have this, watch these videos, they have significantly shorter attention spans after, right? And this suggests that there are detrimental effects to spending so much of their time on screens. And I think this is not a good idea. And, of course, what's happening, at least during the pandemic, children were doing classes online where, of course, they were tempted by so many other things they could do online, Instagram, TikTok, so it's, I don't think this is a good position to be putting our kids in.
That was actually the first thing I thought about too, was kind of before we used to talk a lot about screen time as in like total amount of time. And really since the pandemic, it's kind of shifted more to quality over quantity, which I think is the right way for the conversation to go. But specifically that, Gloria, like you mentioned, the Michael Bayification of like blockbuster movies and everything.
Yeah.
Like that example of just sort of like the really fast, frenetic pace of content. Yeah, I know there's been studies on that. I can't remember off the top of my head, but when kids are exposed to like the really fast pace as opposed to slower, gentler kind of content, it did make a difference in academic performance. I remember seeing a couple things that was replicated in, but yeah, I mean, longitudinal is the best way to go. So we could just wait 20 years and see how everyone grows up. But I think a mixed diet, I guess, if that's a kind of a metaphor that could work in terms of like, it doesn't all need to be fast-paced video games and frenetic kind of TikTok, as long as there's a healthier balance of both, and preferably more on the latter side.
I mean, let's come back in 20, 30 years and then find out what we should have done. But it's the problem with all of this research. There's a lot more questions coming in. But can I pick up this one about planning fallacy? And so the question is, what's your take on planning fallacy, being too ambitious about how much you can achieve? Would things be better if we were better at planning? Or is that barking up the wrong tree because we're still going to be disappointed by how much we actually managed to achieve in a certain time?
You want to start or should I?
I'll start just by saying I think that's a really good question, and I don't really know. Most people that I've met, including myself, aren't very good at planning when it comes to forecasting into the future how long a specific task will take. Some people are better than others at this, but I find it really hard. Like some of it goes with experience in terms of like it'll take me this number of hours to prepare for a talk or these sort of things. But that is one thing that I feel like the increased serendipity of the internet in terms of I'm only going to spend this long on something until we find something that we didn't expect to see. Serendipity is mostly a good thing when it comes online, but I feel like that's made it harder for us to plan too. And the fact that we have so many means by which we can get in touch with people and people can get in touch with us that it's made it harder. Yeah, so that's like a partial answer.
I think that people are just really bad at planning. So they do plan, but they're just not planning the right way. And so, if you're planning a task, what people typically do is they plan in terms of time. They make an estimate of, okay, this task is going to take me 2 hours. I'm going to block out 2 hours for it. But tasks, everything we do is so multifaceted, right? There's, of course, the intellectual work that's done. There's also, and we don't think about it, there's an emotional valence that's associated to a task. And so things that make us happy, of course, we can get through those, probably quicker than those things that are just onerous and we're not motivated to work on. And so I think people need to think about how to design their day. And you design your day not just in terms of slots of time, but in terms of, here's a task, it's going to be hard, I'm not going to be happy about doing it. Let me follow it with some kind of activity that's going to make me happy. I'm going to have a conversation with my good friend, right? And I'm going to allot this amount of time for it. And if we think about designing our day, right, and we do it very carefully, then I think we can become better at planning. And of course, a lot of it is trial and error, right? It took acupuncture 4,000 years to figure it out. And we're just starting in the digital age. So I think that we do need to learn from our mistakes and improve our planning.
Let me follow up. Oh, sorry, Julian. To another answer, which I've just shared in the chat. There's a book by Dan Gilbert called Stumbling on Happiness. So he's a psychologist at Harvard, I think. But basically, he covers that more specifically about we're really bad at forecasting into the future what our future selves are going to be like. And I mean the immediate future, too. And it covers everything from I should put money into my retirement account. It's a better deal. The heck with future me because I want to buy the thing right now. And that's what I want in the moment. The same sort of thing applies to junk food as opposed to like, well, my future self will probably be better off without it, but I want this right now. So that's a little bit of a different take on kind of just how our inherent psychology shows that it's hard to do because we're thinking in terms of our present self and trying to guess what this slightly different self is going to be like and what they're going to want in slightly different circumstances. So that could be a more thorough answer to that question. It's an interesting book, so worth checking out.
One thing that we haven't talked about much when it comes to planning is interruptions, because there's an assumption that you have control over your day. Whereas actually increasing people do get interrupted constantly by things which come up. Do you have thoughts on what's the best way to manage that process? How to control, or is it right to say you should try to control when you are and are not interruptible, or what's the advice?
Well, first off, as I mentioned, about half the time we're interrupted by ourselves, right? So we can't just blame it on notifications. And I think, when I talked about this idea of, practicing meta-awareness, that can help us gain control over these kinds of self-interruptions. At least it raises what's non-conscious up to a conscious level. And once it becomes a conscious level, then we have more agency about how to control them. But in terms of external interruptions. Yes, of course, we do. There are easy things you can do. You can turn off your notifications. You can restructure your visual interface so that you're not so tempted by things that you want to click on. Put your phone out of reach. We can create what I call hooks, which actually would help us get out of self-interruption mode. And a hook is you schedule some rote activity right before you've got a meeting, or right before there's some forcing function that's where you have to stop, right? Catching the bus to go home from work, something. So it becomes a hook to pull you out. But of course, we can't always control external notifications, and we shouldn't if they're from people, because there could be something positive that comes out of external interruptions.
Yeah, I will quickly share this link for my favorite app, the Freedom app, in terms of it's a distraction blocker, basically. But the cool thing about it is you can actually schedule them ahead of time, which is very valuable in terms of, or as like, I really need to focus the 2 hours before this class, or et cetera. So putting that, again, this is the future self thing, using that knowledge to our advantage. Current me is going to tell future me is like, don't get distracted 2 hours before class because you need to work on it. And then I'll set blocks, say no email, no phone calls, no social media. I do that. And it's amazing the number of times I still check my email. And when those things are happening, it's like, oh, then it gets me back, pulls me back into it. It's like, I don't actually need to check email right now. But anyways, I put some tips there in the blog that I found useful. So it's really just about my own personal workflow and kind of scheduling ahead of time, like knowing when we're going to be distracted and when we don't want to be distracted. We can use tools, free tools for the most part, to kind of help us do some of the hard work for us.
Thank you. I think that's very helpful. And anybody who hasn't had a look at that can have a look at it now. But we've got time for a couple more questions. One's come in from Jane Taylor, looking slightly broader, not just about individual tasks. Jane asks, would you say there's an ideal length of a working day or week or amount of annual leave to maximize productivity and well-being? Are we getting it right, at least here in the UK? I should explain, Gloria, with about 40 hours over 5 days, over 46 or so weeks of the year?
Well, my personal take is we need to cut the workday. And there have been experiments of companies who've done a four-day work week, and they found that workers were just as productive as in a 5-day work week. I think that with shorter work weeks and shorter hours per day, people will be able to accomplish just as much, perhaps even more, right? Because there's a finite amount of time to accomplish things. And I'll give you an example. We did a study where we had people, they were either receiving interruptions or doing a task without interruptions. And the interruptions happened to be email, because that's the most common form of interruption. And we found that in those conditions where people were interrupted, they actually performed better. They were more efficient, and they accomplished more in a shorter amount of time. And the explanation is because they understood there was a finite amount of time. And people in a workday, if you have to leave the workplace at 5 o'clock or so, you'll speed up toward the end of the day. You might start the day slow and you'll speed up toward the end, knowing there's going to be a hard stop. But I also have to mention, full disclosure, that people performed more efficiently, but there was a cost, which was higher stress.
That actually pairs well with what I was going to say about it's hard in terms of number of hours. And I've seen other, mostly tech companies, I want to say Dropbox or maybe Slack or one of those, but they experimented, a few companies have done this with like meeting free days, as in 1 day a week, like no meetings, nothing else, just work on your work stuff. I think personally, I think that's a great idea. Some days are really hard. The days that feel more stressful to me are the meeting heavy days, especially. I get decision fatigue so much in terms of, should we do this? When should we do that? Who should do that? By the end of the day, if there's something about, it's like, should we have chicken or fish for dinner? Like, I want to run in the other direction in terms of like, I can't like think in terms of all these things. Those feel like very high stress, very draining days. Whereas an 8-hour day where I'm kind of left to myself and get to do some research and some writing and all of this, that's a very different, it's almost like a video game health meter. Like, I feel very different in terms of like how those 2 types of days go. So stress is a big part of it.
Yeah, the 8-hour work days are draining our cognitive resources. And when we're drained, we just have less resources to devote to things like making a decision about chicken or fish. Right? It also, ironically, the more our resources are drained, the less capacity we have to guard against distractions. And we get interrupted more easily because there's a part of our brain called executive function, and it's just worn out by the end of the day. And it just can't help us, protect ourselves from being distracted.
We have time for one last question. And the question is going to be from somebody called Tyler Shores. Tyler.
Yeah, I'll ask the last question for Gloria. Since you mentioned the new book you're working on, any sneak preview or any sort of last words so we can kind of keep an eye on that book, what we should know about your book and what to expect?
Well, part of what I talked about, or I should say what I talked about today, will comprise part of the book. And the book is just an expansive coverage of attention span on our devices. So it's covering scientific research, my own and others, about our interruptions, our multitasking, different kinds of attentional states. It also covers the reasons, these underlying forces that I talked about for why we're distracted so much. And then the third part of the book is the way forward. So what we can do about it. And, you might think after hearing about all these forces that can make it hard for us to focus, do people have any free will, or is free will with our devices just an illusion? So I talk about that and I address that. And then I mentioned the meta-awareness. I talk about other things that people can do to try to gain control and gain agency of our attention. And then I close with the future of attention and, how we might think about regulation, how we might just reframe our conception of work so that we're not so exhausted. And I want to emphasize, I am not talking about giving up our devices. We're just in this too deep. We can't give up our devices. What we need to do is learn how to live with them and how to live with them productively and to enhance our well-being.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
I think that's a wonderful way to finish this, with a really profound thing, something to look forward to. And thank you to both of you for raising so many interesting things, discussing so much, the myths, the realities, tips and advice. I will certainly be trying to do not necessarily everything that you've suggested, but quite a lot of them. And I hope it's made a difference to other people's as well. So thank you very much for joining us. And that's all that we have for this year's Cambridge Festival, but we have lots and lots of other events. So just before we finish, the next event that we have is on the 27th of April, the Wednesday, where we're talking about Twitter, Power and Responsibility, with Nick Pickles, who is, I think, the Global Head of Public Policy for Twitter. I think that's the right title. So he'll be joining us to talk about everything to do with Twitter. So, the two of you may wish to join us for that as well. But have a very good time. Thank you for being with us. And thanks in particular to Gloria and to Tyler. All the best.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Hopefully we'll do this again.
Yes.